Some mistakes follow you forever, no matter how far you run. Some choices haunt your dreams until the day you die. Ezekiel Ashborne knew this truth better than most. For 20 years, the old mountain man had lived alone in the Colorado wilderness, carrying a burden that felt heavier than any winter storm. His cabin sat miles from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but pine trees and painful memories. He traded furs twice a year and spoke to no soul in between. But on this bitter winter night, as snow fell like judgment from heaven, fate came knocking at his door. A young woman collapsed in the storm, half dead and running from something terrible. When Zeke pulled her inside and heard her hum a simple melody, his blood turned cold. He recognized that song. Could it really be her after all these years? Before we continue this tale, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The melody lingered in the air like smoke from a dying fire, and Ezekiel Ashborne felt 20 years of carefully constructed walls crumble in an instant. He stood frozen in the doorway of his cabin, the unconscious woman cradled in his arms, her slight frame barely weighing more than a sack of grain. Snow continued to whip through the open door behind him, but he couldn't seem to move his feet. The tune she'd hummed so soft he'd almost missed it beneath the howling wind was branded into his memory like a cattle mark. Simple notes, childlike in their innocence, yet they carried the weight of a tragedy he'd tried for 2 decades to forget. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he finally stepped inside and kicked the door shut against the storm. The cabin welcomed them with warmth from the stone fireplace, its golden light dancing across walls lined with hand-hewn logs. This place had been his sanctuary for 20 years, every board and nail positioned by his own calloused hands. Shelves held jars of preserved vegetables, dried herbs hanging in bundles from the rafters above. A simple table stood near the window, surrounded by chairs he'd carved during long winter evenings when the silence grew too heavy to bear. But tonight, the silence was broken. Zeke carried the woman to his own bed, the only proper sleeping place in the single-room cabin. She was young, maybe 25 or 30, with auburn hair that had once been carefully arranged, but now hung in wet tangles around her pale face. Her clothes were little more than rags, a thin dress that had offered no protection against the mountain cold. Whoever she was, wherever she'd come from, she'd been running hard and running scared. As he pulled rough woolen blankets up to her chin, Zeke caught himself studying her features with an intensity that surprised him. Something about the curve of her cheek, the way her dark lashes rested against her skin, seemed familiar. But then again, after 20 years of seeing nothing but his own reflection in the mirror, any human face might seem like something from a half-remembered dream. He moved to the kitchen area, muscle memory guiding him through the motions of heating water and gathering supplies. His hands, large and scarred from decades of hard living, moved with surprising gentleness as he prepared warm broth and clean cloths. These same hands had once killed men in service to his country. They'd built this cabin log by log, trapped animals for food and fur, survived harsh winters that would have claimed lesser men. But tonight they shook as he tended to a stranger who hummed songs from his past. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up. Wind rattled the shutters and sent snow spiraling down the chimney to hiss against the fire. This was the kind of weather that killed travelers, the reason smart folk stayed close to town during the winter months. What had driven this woman out into such conditions? What was she? Running from that seemed worse than freezing to death in a Colorado blizzard. Zeke had learned long ago not to ask too many questions. The mountains attracted people who valued their privacy, folks who'd rather face the dangers of isolation than whatever waited for them in civilization. He'd been one of those people himself, fleeing to this remote valley after losing everything that mattered to him. The war had taken his innocence, but it was what came after the night his wife and young son were murdered by Confederate raiders seeking revenge that had truly broken him. He'd built this cabin in 1855, choosing a spot high in the Rockies, where the nearest neighbor was a day's hard ride away. The town of Pine Ridge lay 15 miles down the mountain, close enough for twice-yearly supply runs, but far enough to ensure his solitude. Most folks there knew him only as the hermit who traded quality furs for necessities, paid his debts in silver coin, and never stayed longer than necessary. The woman stirred restlessly, mumbling words he couldn't quite catch. Zeke found himself moving closer, drawn by some instinct he couldn't name. In the firelight, her face seemed even younger, vulnerable in a way that made his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. When was the last time he'd felt responsible for another human being? When had he last cared whether someone lived or died? He thought of the wooden horse tucked away in his dresser drawer, a child's toy he'd carved years ago during a particularly lonely winter. He'd told himself it was just something to keep his hands busy, but the truth was harder to admit. Sometimes a man needed to create something innocent and pure, something that reminded him there was still good in the world. The horse was rough-hewn, hardly a masterpiece, but he'd sanded it smooth and carved flowing lines into its mane. For 20 years it had sat in that drawer, a reminder of the gentleness he'd thought was lost forever. Now, watching this stranger sleep in his bed, Zeke wondered if perhaps gentleness, like hope, was harder to kill than he'd imagined. The woman's breathing was steady now, her color improving as warmth returned to her body. She was beautiful, he realized, though it was the kind of beauty that spoke of hardship endured rather than privilege enjoyed. Her hands, when he'd checked them for frostbite, were soft but showed recent calluses, as if she'd been doing unfamiliar work. There were old scars on her wrists, thin white lines that told stories he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. As the night wore on, Zeke found himself unable to sleep. He sat in his chair by the fire, whittling a piece of pine and watching over his unexpected guest. The melody she'd hummed continued to echo in his mind, bringing with it fragments of memory he'd tried so hard to bury. A burning wagon, a child's terrified screams, the weight of a small body in his arms as he carried her to safety. But that was impossible. That little girl would be grown now, probably married with children of her own, somewhere far from these mountains. The chances of her finding her way back here, to him, were beyond remote. It was just his guilt-ridden mind playing tricks, seeing connections where none existed. Still, when the woman began to hum again in her sleep that same haunting melody, Zeke's knife slipped and cut deep into his thumb. He watched the blood well up, dark red in the firelight, and wondered if some wounds were simply destined to reopen no matter how much time had passed. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault on the mountain, but inside the cabin, warmth and light held the darkness at bay. Two strangers, bound together by circumstance and the echo of a half-remembered song, waited for morning to reveal what fate had brought to their door. The woman slept on, her breathing deep and peaceful now, while Zeke Ashborne sat watch through the longest night of his life, guarding secrets that might destroy in them both if they ever came to light. Dawn came slowly to the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. Zeke had dozed fitfully in his chair, jerking awake at every sound the woman made. When her eyes finally opened, they were the color of deep forest pools, intelligent and wary. "Where am I?" Her voice was hoarse but educated, carrying the refined accent of someone who'd received proper schooling. "My cabin," Zeke replied, setting down his coffee cup. "Found you half-frozen in the storm last night. Name's Ezekiel Ashborne, but most folks call me Zeke." She struggled to sit up, wincing as movement awakened stiff muscles. "I'm Melody Rivers." The name seemed to catch in her throat, as if she wasn't quite sure of it herself. Melody. The name hit Zeke like a physical blow, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. 20 years ago, the terrified child he'd pulled from that burning wagon had whispered her name through tears and smoke. "Melody Rose, mister. My name's Melody Rose. You were running from something," he said, studying her face for any flicker of recognition. Storm like that doesn't catch folks by surprise unless they're not paying attention to where they're going. Her hands moved instinctively to smooth her tangled hair, and Zeke noticed something that made his breath catch. Her fingers were soft, uncalloused, except for recent marks that suggested unfamiliar work. These weren't the hands of a frontier woman who'd spent years scrubbing laundry and churning butter. These were the hands of someone who'd lived a different kind of life until very recently. "I don't want to burden you with my troubles," Melody said, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "If you could just point me toward the nearest town, I'll be on my way." "Town's 15 miles down a mountain trail that's buried under 3 feet of snow," Zeke replied. "Won't be passable for days, maybe weeks, depending on how long this weather holds." Fear flashed across her features before she could hide it. "I can't stay here that long. They'll find me." "Who's they?" Melody's jaw tightened. "People who want something I don't have to give." Before Zeke could press further, the sound of horses reached them through the cabin walls, multiple riders, moving fast despite the snow. Melody went pale as death, pressing herself back against the headboard. "Get down," Zeke ordered, moving to the window with the fluid grace of an old soldier. 3 men on horseback had stopped at the edge of his clearing, their horses steaming in the cold air. They wore city clothes under heavy coats, and all 3 carried rifles across their saddles. "Ezekiel Ashborne," one of them called out. "We know you're in there. We just want to talk." Zeke cracked the shutter and called back. "Then talk. We're looking for a woman, about 25, auburn hair. She's dangerous, killed a man down in Denver. There's a reward for information." Melody's sharp intake of breath confirmed what Zeke already suspected. These men weren't lawmen. Real peace officers would have identified themselves properly, shown badges, followed protocol. These were hired guns, and that meant whoever wanted Melody had money and influence. "Haven't seen any woman," Zeke lied smoothly. "Been snowed in for 2 days. Mind if we take a look around? Just to be sure?" "Yes, I mind. This is private property, and you're not welcome on it." The leader's voice hardened. "We could make this official, old man. You could try." Zeke's tone carried the quiet authority of someone who'd faced down armed men before and lived to tell about it. "But I'm betting you'd rather not involve actual law enforcement in whatever business you're conducting." After a long moment, the leader spurred his horse. "We'll be back. This woman is worth a lot of money to important people. Don't get caught harboring a killer." They rode away, but Zeke knew they wouldn't go far. Men like that didn't give up easily, especially when money was involved. "Killer?" he asked, turning back to Melody. Her face crumpled. "It's not what you think. I never wanted." She stopped, shaking her head. "You should turn me over to them. You don't know what kind of trouble I'll bring to your door." Instead of answering, Zeke moved to the loose floorboard near his bed and pried it up. Beneath lay a small cache of supplies he'd hoped never to need: ammunition, silver coins, and wrapped in oilcloth, a charred piece of wood about the size of his hand. The burnt wagon wheel fragment looked innocuous enough, but as Zeke unwrapped it, memories crashed over him like an avalanche. 20 years ago, he'd been heading home from a scouting mission when he saw the glow on the horizon. By the time he reached the burning wagon train, most of the settlers were already dead. Confederate raiders had hit the convoy, killing the men and taking whatever they could carry. But they'd missed one: a little girl hiding beneath an overturned wagon, clutching a rag doll and humming to herself to block out the screams. She couldn't have been more than 5 or 6, with auburn curls and eyes green as spring leaves. Her parents lay dead nearby, but she just kept humming that simple melody, rocking back and forth as flames consumed everything she'd ever known. He'd pulled her from the wreckage, wrapped her in his coat, and carried her through the night to the nearest settlement. There, a preacher named Marcus had promised to care for her, to find her family or a good home. Zeke had pressed a silver dollar into the child's palm and told her to be brave, that everything would be all right. Melody Rose. The little girl's name had been Melody Rose. "The song you were humming," Zeke said carefully, still holding the burnt wood. "Where did you learn it?" I don't know, Melody replied, confusion clouding her features. I've always known it. Sometimes when I'm scared or lonely, it just comes to me. Why? Zeke rewrapped the wagon wheel fragment with hands that trembled slightly. He'd kept it all these years as a reminder of failure, of the child he'd saved, only to abandon to an uncertain fate. Now that child was sitting in his cabin, grown into a woman who was running from killers and didn't even remember the night that had changed both their lives. No reason, he lied. Just reminded me of something from long ago. But as he looked into Melody's green eyes, Zeke saw something that made his heart clench. Deep beneath the fear and exhaustion, there was something achingly familiar. The way she tilted her head when she was thinking, the unconscious gesture of tucking her hair behind her ear, the melody that seemed to surface whenever she felt threatened. 20 years ago, he'd made a choice that haunted him still. He'd given that terrified child to people he thought he could trust, believing it was for the best. Now she was here, hunted by dangerous men and carrying secrets that could get them both killed. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, 3 riders waited for their chance to claim their prize. But inside the cabin, surrounded by the ghosts of choices made and chances lost, Zeke Ashborne faced the most important decision of his life. This time, he wouldn't let her go. The riders returned at midday, just as Zeke had expected. This time they didn't bother with pleasantries. "We know she's in there, old man," the leader called out, his horse pawing restlessly at the snow. "Saw her tracks leading right to your door. Hand her over and nobody gets hurt." Zeke stepped onto his porch, rifle cradled casually in his arms. Behind him, Melody pressed herself against the cabin wall, out of sight but close enough to hear every word. "Told you before, haven't seen any woman." His voice carried the calm authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "And I told you, this is private property. You're trespassing. There's $500 in it for you," the second rider offered, leaning forward in his saddle. "Easy money for just looking the other way. Don't need your money." The leader's patience was wearing thin. "Look, we know what she is. Melody Rivers murdered her husband in cold blood, took his money, and ran. She's a killer, and she's dangerous. You're harboring a fugitive." "Is that so?" Zeke's tone remained conversational. "Funny thing about killers, they usually don't collapse half dead in snowstorms. They plan their escapes better. She's clever, I'll give her that. But we've got friends in Denver, friends in the territorial government. This won't end well for you if you keep protecting her." Zeke shifted his grip on the rifle, a subtle movement that all 3 men noticed. "I fought in a war where friends in government got good men killed because they thought their connections made them untouchable. Didn't work out well for them either." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. After a long moment, the leader pulled his horse around. "This isn't over. We'll be watching." They rode away, but Zeke knew they'd only go far enough to set up a proper watch. Men with that much determination and backing wouldn't give up after one conversation. He found Melody sitting on his bed, her face pale but determined. "I should leave, tonight, when they're not expecting it. You'd be dead before dawn." Zeke set his rifle in its rack by the door. "These mountains don't forgive mistakes, especially in winter." "Then what do you suggest? They're not going to give up." Zeke studied her carefully. Something had changed in her demeanor during the confrontation. The frightened woman who'd awakened that morning had been replaced by someone harder, more calculating. It was as if facing her pursuers had awakened something in her that had been sleeping. "Tell me the truth," he said, "about this husband you supposedly killed." Melody's laugh held no humor. "Supposedly? They're right about that part. Harrison Blackwood is dead, and I'm the one who killed him." The admission should have shocked him, but Zeke found himself unsurprised. There was something in her eyes, not guilt exactly, but the haunted look of someone who'd done what was necessary to survive. "Why?" "Because he was going to kill me." She reached into her dress and withdrew a silver locket, opening it to reveal a faded photograph of a man, woman, and small child standing beside a covered wagon. This was my family, my real family, before Harrison bought me from the missionaries who raised me. The photograph hit Zeke like a physical blow. He recognized the wagon, the faces, the scene. It was from before the raid, before the burning, before everything went wrong. Bought you? The preacher who took me in when I was little, Marcus was his name. He ran a sort of business. Took in orphans, raised them just enough to make them useful, then sold them to whoever was willing to pay. Harrison wanted a young wife who couldn't run home to family. Someone he could control completely. Zeke's hands clenched into fists. Preacher Marcus, the man he'd trusted with an innocent child's life, had been nothing more than a slave trader in religious clothing. How long were you married to him? 8 years. 8 years of being told I was worthless, that I should be grateful for his protection. He'd like to remind me that without him, I'd be nothing but a dead orphan's memory. But you fought back. Melody nodded, touching the locket gently. Harrison was involved in land speculation, buying property from families and then having them killed or driven off so he could claim it legally. I found documents in his study, names, dates, payments to men like the ones outside. When he caught me reading them, he said it was time I learned to keep my mouth shut permanently. Self-defense. Try explaining that to a territorial judge when the dead man owns half the politicians in Denver. Melody closed the locket and tucked it away. I took the documents and enough money to get away. I've been running ever since. Zeke moved to his kitchen area, needing something to do with his hands while he processed what she'd told him. The woman sitting in his cabin wasn't just the child he'd saved 20 years ago. She was living proof of how badly he'd failed her. You can read, he observed, pulling down a book from his shelf. Not many frontier women have that skill. Harrison insisted I be educated. Said an ignorant wife reflected poorly on him. Melody accepted the book, a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets, and ran her fingers over the leather binding. He never expected I'd use that education against him. What's your plan now? Get these documents to someone who can use them. Harrison had business partners, people who'll want to cover their tracks. But there are honest men in the territorial government, and some of the families he destroyed are still alive to testify. Zeke watched her flip through the book, noting how naturally she held it, how her eyes moved across the pages with practiced ease. This wasn't someone pretending to literacy. This was a woman who found comfort in books. Those men outside aren't going to let you ride out of here with evidence that could hang their employers. I know. Melody looked up from the book, and for a moment Zeke saw the frightened child she'd once been. I know I'm probably going to die here, but at least I tried. The simple acceptance in her voice cut through him like a blade. She'd already resigned herself to death, was just going through the motions of resistance because it was better than giving up completely. Not if I have anything to say about it. Melody tilted her head, studying his face. Why would you help me? You don't even know me. But that wasn't true, and they both knew it. There was something between them, a connection neither could quite name but both could feel. It hummed in the air like that melody she carried, binding them together in ways that had nothing to do with logic or common sense. Maybe I'm just tired of running from things, Zeke said finally. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters and sending snow swirling around the cabin. Somewhere in the trees, 3 men waited with guns and warrants, and the backing of powerful people who preferred their secrets buried. But inside, by the warmth of the fire, 2 people who had more in common than either yet realized began to plan their survival. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the snow-covered clearing, Zeke found himself sharing more than he'd intended. Melody had insisted on preparing their simple meal, moving around his kitchen with surprising efficiency for someone who claimed to be running for her life. You don't cook like a woman who's been living rough, he observed, watching her dice wild onions with practiced strokes. Harrison insisted his wife be accomplished in domestic arts. Her voice carried a bitter edge. Amazing how quickly you learn when failure means going hungry. Zeke winced at the casual reference to abuse. What about before? Before this, Harrison bought you from the preacher. Melody paused, her knife hovering over the cutting board. I remember fragments. A woman's voice singing. Strong hands lifting me onto a horse, the smell of wood smoke and prairie grass. She resumed chopping, her movements more deliberate now. And always that melody. It comes to me in dreams sometimes, like an echo from another life. The preacher who took you in, Marcus, what was his full name? Marcus Hendricks. He ran a mission outside Denver, claimed to be saving orphans from lives of sin and degradation. Melody's laugh held no warmth. I suppose he wasn't entirely wrong. Death would have been degradation enough. Marcus Hendricks, the name burned in Zeke's memory like a brand he'd trusted. That man believed his promises to find little Melody Rose a good home. Instead, he'd delivered her into a life of slavery and abuse. I knew him, Zeke said quietly. Melody's knife stilled. What? 20 years ago, I had occasion to meet Preacher Hendricks, trusted him to help someone who needed protection. The admission tasted like ashes in his mouth. I was wrong about him. Who did you trust him to help? Zeke moved to his chest of drawers, pulled out the bottom one, and reached underneath. His fingers found the object he'd hidden there years ago, a water-damaged Bible bound in cracked leather. When he opened it, a child's drawing fluttered to the floor. Melody gasped, dropping her knife as she recognized the crude but unmistakable sketch. A man in a hat, a woman in a dress, a small child, and beside them, a horse with a flowing mane. At the bottom, in a child's careful letters, someone had written, "My family." Where did you get this? Her voice was barely a whisper. Found it in this Bible the night I met Preacher Hendricks. A little girl had been drawing in it, trying to remember her family after they were killed in a wagon train raid. Melody sank into the chair beside him, her face pale as mountain snow. I drew this. I remember now, sitting in Marcus's mission, trying not to forget what my parents looked like. He said it was God's will that I forget my old life, that dwelling on the past was sinful. But you kept drawing, until he burned my sketches and beat me for disobedience. Melody touched the drawing with trembling fingers. How do you have this? Zeke closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 20 years of guilt pressing down on him. Because I'm the one who brought you to him. I'm the one who saved you from that burning wagon train, and I'm the one who handed you over to a man who sold you into slavery. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Outside, wind rattled the shutters, but inside the cabin, the only sound was the crackling of the fire and Melody's quick, shallow breathing. You, she whispered, you're the man from my dreams, the one with gentle hands who carried me through the smoke. I thought I was saving you. Marcus promised he'd find you a good family, people who'd love you and keep you safe. Zeke's voice cracked with old pain. I rode away thinking I'd done the right thing. Instead, you delivered me to 8 years of hell. The accusation hung between them like a blade. Zeke had imagined this moment countless times, the day his past would catch up with him and demand an accounting. He'd always pictured it differently, thought he'd have noble words to offer, explanations that might ease the burden of his guilt. Instead, he had nothing but the truth. Yes, he said simply. I did. Melody stood abruptly, pacing to the window where she could see snowflakes dancing in the dying light. All those years, I wondered about you. The man who saved me from the fire only to disappear like smoke. I used to imagine you were my father, come back from the dead to rescue me. Later, I convinced myself you were just a fever dream, something my mind created to cope with the loss. I'm sorry doesn't seem adequate. No, it doesn't. She turned back to face him, and Zeke was surprised to see tears on her cheeks. But you couldn't have known what Marcus really was. I've spent years blaming everyone, God, fate, the raiders who killed my parents. Maybe it's time I stopped. You have every right to hate me. I'm tired of hating. Melody wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Hate is what kept me alive for 8 years, what gave me the strength to kill Harrison when he tried to murder me. But I'm so tired of carrying it around." She moved back to the table, picked up the child's drawing, and studied it with new eyes. "Tell me about that night. Tell me about my parents." So Zeke did. He told her about arriving too late to save the wagon train, about finding her parents' bodies, and the way her mother's hand had been reaching toward where Melody had been hiding. He described her father's face, peaceful despite the violence of his death, and how her mother had been clutching a locket, the same silver locket Melody now wore. "They loved you," he said. "Even dying, they were trying to protect you." "What were their names? I can barely remember." "Thomas and Sarah Fletcher. Your father was a surveyor, heading west to map territories for the railroad. Your mother kept a journal. I saved what pages I could from the fire." Melody's breath caught. "You have her journal?" Zeke nodded toward the Bible. "Whatever survived is pressed between those pages. Not much, but maybe enough to give you back some of what was taken." As night settled over the mountains, they sat together reading the fragments of Sarah Fletcher's journal, piecing together memories of a family destroyed by violence and a child lost to circumstance. Outside, their enemies waited in the cold, but inside the cabin, two damaged souls began the delicate work of healing wounds that had festered for 20 years. The melody hummed had new meaning now, not just a fragment of memory, but a bridge connecting her to parents who'd loved her and a man who'd tried, however imperfectly, to save her from the flames. 3 days passed in uneasy peace. The hunters had withdrawn to Pine Ridge, but Zeke knew they were simply regrouping, waiting for reinforcements or a better opportunity. He'd spotted smoke from their campfire in the valley below, a constant reminder that their sanctuary was temporary. Melody had thrown herself into the routines of cabin life with an intensity that spoke of someone trying to outrun her thoughts. She mended his shirts with tiny, precise stitches, organized his sparse belongings with military efficiency, and cooked meals that transformed his simple provisions into something approaching comfort food. "You don't have to earn your keep," Zeke told her as she scrubbed his floors for the second time that week. "I need to stay busy." She didn't look up from her work. "Idle hands give me too much time to think." He understood that feeling. After losing his family, he'd thrown himself into building this cabin with the same desperate energy, as if hard work could somehow fill the hollow spaces grief had carved in his chest. It was while checking his trap lines that morning that Zeke found the crumpled paper blown against a pine tree near the creek. The wind had carried it up from the valley below, and when he smoothed out the wrinkles, his blood turned to ice. "Wanted. Melody Rivers $500 reward, dead or alive. For the murder of Harrison Blackwood, contact Deputy Marshal Williams, Denver Territory below." The text was a crude but recognizable sketch of Melody's face. Someone had paid good money to have these notices printed and distributed. This wasn't just about recovering stolen money, this was a manhunt backed by serious resources. Zeke rode back to the cabin with the poster folded in his coat pocket, his mind racing through possibilities. $500 was more money than most mountain men saw in 2 years. Word of that kind of reward would spread fast, bringing every bounty hunter and desperate man within 100 miles straight to their door. He found Melody hanging laundry on a line she'd strung between 2 trees, humming that haunting melody as she worked. The domestic scene struck him with unexpected force. How natural she looked here, how right it felt to come home to someone who belonged in his space. "We need to talk," he said, dismounting heavily. She took one look at his face and knew. "They found us. Not yet. But they're making sure everyone in the territory knows to look for you." He pulled out the wanted poster, watching her face go pale as she read it. "Dead or alive," she whispered, "they're not planning to bring me back for trial. Tell me everything about these. The documents you took from Blackwood. Everything." Melody set down the wet shirt she'd been hanging and moved to sit on the cabin's front step. Harrison was part of a group called the Colorado Development Company. On paper, they were legitimate buying land, investing in mining claims, supporting railroad expansion. In reality, they were stealing everything they could get their hands on. How? They'd identify families with valuable property, good farmland, mineral rights, water access. Then they'd arrange for raids, claim jumping, or legal challenges. When the families couldn't fight back anymore, the company would buy their land for pennies on the dollar. Zeke felt a familiar cold anger building in his chest, like your parents' wagon train. Exactly like that. My father wasn't just a surveyor, he was documenting illegal mining operations and fraudulent land claims. The raid that killed him wasn't random Confederate violence. It was murder for hire. And you have proof of this. Melody nodded, touching the space beneath her dress where she kept the locket. Account ledgers, correspondence, payment records, enough to hang a dozen men and expose corruption that goes all the way to the territorial government. Where are these documents now? Hidden. Even if they kill me, they won't find them easily. Zeke studied her face, noting the careful way she'd avoided giving him specifics. Smart woman, even trusting him with her life didn't mean trusting him with information that could get them both killed. The men hunting you, they're not law enforcement. No. Harrison's business partners hired private contractors, men who specialize in making problems disappear permanently. Melody's voice carried the flat tone of someone discussing the weather. They've been following me for weeks, getting closer each time. I thought the storm would give me enough cover to lose them, but it led you here instead. Straight to the one person in the world who'd have reason to help me. She looked at him with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. Funny how fate works, isn't it? Zeke wasn't sure he believed in fate, but he was beginning to suspect that some debts followed a man no matter how far he ran from them. 20 years ago, he'd failed to protect an innocent child. Now that child had grown into a woman who needed his protection again, and this time, he wasn't going to let someone else take responsibility for her safety. "We need to get you out of these mountains," he said. "Somewhere you can turn those documents over to people who'll act on them. I've been trying to reach Fort Collins. There's a territorial judge there, Samuel Morrison, who has a reputation for honesty. If I can get the evidence to him, that's 200 miles through country that's crawling with bounty hunters looking for your face." "I know the odds." Melody stood, brushing snow from her skirt. "But what's the alternative? Hide here until they bring enough men to storm your cabin. Let Harrison's partners continue destroying families like mine." Zeke considered their options, none of them good. Every trail out of these mountains led through settlements where that wanted poster would be pinned to every saloon wall and sheriff's office. Every town between here and Fort Collins would have men watching for a woman matching Melody's description. But sitting still wasn't an option either. Those hunters in the valley below wouldn't wait forever, and winter wouldn't last long enough to starve them out. Sooner or later, they'd make their move, and when they did, Zeke and Melody would be trapped in this cabin with nowhere to run. "There might be another way," he said slowly, "but it would mean trusting people I haven't spoken to in 20 years. "What people?" "Mountain men like me. Trappers, prospectors, folks who know these hills better than any bounty hunter from Denver." Zeke looked out at the snow-covered peaks surrounding them. "There are ways through this country that don't show up on any map, trails that only locals know. If I can get word to the right people, they'd help us?" "They'd help me. Whether they'd help you depends on how I ask." Melody was quiet for a long moment, weighing risks and possibilities. Finally, she nodded. "What do you need me to do?" "Stay alive," Zeke said simply, "and trust me not to fail you again." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the snowfields red and gold, they began planning their escape from a trap that was tightening around them like a noose. Somewhere in the valley below, men with guns and warrants waited for their chance, while up in the cabin, two people bound by 20 years of guilt and redemption prepared to bet their lives on the kindness of strangers and the loyalty of old friends. The wanted poster lay on the table between them, a reminder that some mistakes couldn't be outrun, they could only be faced head-on, with courage and the hope that this time things might end differently. The next morning, while organizing supplies for their eventual escape, Melody made a discovery that changed everything she thought she knew about her protector. She was searching for extra ammunition in Zeke's chest when her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic wedged behind the bottom drawer. "Zeke," she called, her voice strange. "What is this?" He looked up from cleaning his rifle to see her holding a tarnished bronze medal suspended from a faded blue ribbon. The metal caught the firelight, revealing the distinctive star shape and eagle that marked it as something significant. "Put that back," he said quietly. Instead, Melody turned the medal over, reading the inscription on the reverse. "Congressional Medal of Honor, awarded to Sergeant Ezekiel Ashborne for conspicuous gallantry above and beyond the call of duty at the Battle of Antietam." She looked up at him with new eyes. "You're a war hero." "I'm a man who did what needed doing and lived to regret it. This is the highest military honor the country can give. What did you do to earn it?" Zeke set down his rifle and moved to the window, staring out at the snow-covered clearing where their enemies waited. He'd spent 20 years trying to forget that medal and what it represented, but Melody deserved to know who she was trusting with her life. "Antietam was a slaughter," he said finally. "Two armies grinding each other to pieces over a creek that wasn't worth the blood spilled for it. My unit got pinned down in a cornfield, surrounded by Confederate sharpshooters who were picking us off one by one." "So you broke out?" "No. I went back in. The memory tasted like smoke and copper. 3 times. Pulled out 17 wounded men while enemy fire was tearing up the ground around me. By the time I was done, there wasn't a kernel of corn left standing in that field." Melody studied the medal with new understanding. "That's why you know so much about tactics, about reading terrain and planning defenses. War teaches you things no man should have to learn: how to move without being seen, how to think like your enemy, how to kill efficiently and live with what you've done." Zeke turned back to face her. "My wife always said the medal was a reminder of the best thing I'd ever done. I always thought it was proof of the worst." "Why?" "Because saving those men meant I was good at war, and being good at war meant they kept sending me back to it. 3 more years of killing boys who should have been home planting crops or learning trades." His voice carried the weight of old grief. "While I was becoming a professional killer, Confederate raiders burned my house and murdered my family in retaliation for my actions at Antietam." The cabin fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire. Melody set the medal down carefully, as if it were made of glass. "Is that why you came here? To the mountains?" "I came here to die," Zeke admitted. "Figured I'd build a cabin, live off the land until winter or old age took me. Didn't much care which came first." "But you didn't die." "No, turned out I was better at living than I thought. Or maybe just more stubborn." He picked up the medal, weighing it in his palm. "Some days I'm still not sure which." Melody moved closer, studying his weathered face in the firelight. "The men hunting me, they're not soldiers. They're hired killers who think they know how to fight." "What's your point?" "My point is that they're about to learn the difference between killing for money and fighting for something that matters." She gestured toward the medal. "You saved 17 men in one day, while enemy bullets were cutting the air around you. 3 bounty hunters in a snowfield shouldn't be much of a challenge." Despite everything, Zeke found himself almost smiling. "You're developing a ruthless streak. I learned from the best. Harrison taught me that sometimes you have to fight dirty to survive." Melody's expression hardened. "But you're teaching me something he never could, that some things are worth fighting for besides yourself." They spent the afternoon preparing the cabin's defenses, using Zeke's military knowledge to turn their refuge into a fortress. They repositioned furniture to create firing positions, stockpiled ammunition at strategic points, and planned escape routes through the windows and back door. Melody proved surprisingly adept at military thinking, offering suggestions that showed she understood tactics instinctively. When Zeke mentioned the importance of controlling the high ground, she immediately suggested using the cabin's loft as a sniper's nest. When he talked about creating killing fields, she pointed out how the split-rail fence around his vegetable garden could be used to channel attackers into predetermined zones. "Where did you learn this?" he asked, as they worked together to reinforce the shutters. Harrison was paranoid about security. He had books on military strategy, defensive fortifications, guerrilla warfare, anything that might help him protect his stolen wealth. I read them all during the long evenings when he was conducting business. Did he know you were studying his books? Harrison thought women were incapable of understanding such complex subjects. It never occurred to him that his ignorant wife might be learning how to kill him. Melody's smile held no warmth. Men like him always underestimate the people they oppress. It's usually their downfall. As evening approached, they sat by the fire, sharing a simple meal and planning their next moves. The intimacy of their situation, two people alone in a small cabin, preparing to fight side by side, created a bond that neither had expected. "I want you to know," Melody said suddenly, "that even if we don't survive this, finding you again has meant everything to me. For 20 years, I've carried the memory of gentle hands pulling me from the fire. Knowing that man was real, that he cared enough to risk his life for a stranger's child, it changes everything." "You were never a stranger," Zeke replied. "From the moment I saw you in that burning wagon, you were family. And now?" He looked into her green eyes, seeing the frightened child she'd been and the strong woman she'd become. "Now you're the reason I remember what I'm fighting for." Outside, snow began to fall again, adding another layer to the white blanket that covered their mountain sanctuary. Somewhere in the valley below, their enemies waited for their moment, unaware that they were about to face not just a desperate woman and an old hermit, but a decorated war hero, and someone who'd learned survival in the hardest school of all. The medal lay on the table between them, no longer a symbol of past glories or old regrets, but a reminder that some people were born to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. The Glare attack came at dawn, just as Zeke had predicted. 6 men this time, approaching from multiple directions with the coordinated movement of professionals. They'd studied the cabin's layout during their days of watching, knew the defensive positions, and moved to counter them. But they hadn't counted on facing a decorated war veteran who'd been preparing for this moment his entire adult life. "Southeast corner, 2 men with rifles," Zeke called from his position at the front window. "Melody, can you see the ones coming up the creek bed? 3 of them, trying to use the rocks for cover." Her voice was steady, focused. "They don't know about the deadfall you rigged yesterday. The first shots came from the tree line, splintering wood from the cabin's walls, but hitting nothing vital." Zeke had reinforced the structure well, and the thick logs absorbed most of the impact. "Now!" he shouted. Melody triggered the rope release for the deadfall trap, sending a cascade of logs and rocks down into the creek bed. Shouts and curses erupted from below as the attackers scrambled for new cover. The battle that followed was brief but intense. Zeke's military training showed in every movement the way he conserved ammunition, chose his targets, and controlled the engagement's pace. Melody matched his professional calm, calling out positions and providing covering fire when he moved between windows. When the shooting stopped, 4 men lay dead in the snow, and the remaining 2 had fled back toward town. But their victory came with a terrible cost. One of the dying men had used his last breath to deliver information that changed everything. "She's not wanted for theft," the wounded attacker gasped as Zeke knelt beside him. "The woman, she killed Blackwood, yes, but not for money. She's carrying proof that he murdered her whole family 20 years ago." Zeke's blood turned to ice. "What are you talking about?" "Blackwood. He was there. Night of the wagon train. Raid. He paid the raiders. paid them to kill everyone except the girl, wanted her alive for when she grew up. The man's eyes were glazing over, but he forced out the words. She found the records, the payment vouchers, everything. Why? Melody's voice came from behind Zeke, sharp with horror, because he'd been watching her since she was little, obsessed with her from the mission, paid the preacher to hold her until she was old enough to marry. The whole thing, 20 years in the making. The man died with those words on his lips, leaving Zeke and Melody staring at each other in stunned silence. Everything they thought they knew about that night, about Harrison Blackwood, about the conspiracy that had destroyed so many lives, suddenly shifted into a new and terrifying pattern. He planned it all, Melody whispered. From the beginning, my parents' death, my childhood slavery, even my marriage to him. It was all part of some sick obsession. Zeke felt 20 years of guilt transform into something harder and more dangerous, pure rage. All this time, he'd blamed himself for delivering Melody to the wrong person, but the truth was worse. He'd delivered her exactly where her family's killer had wanted her to go. "The documents you took from his study," he said. "They prove this?" Melody reached into her dress with trembling hands and withdrew not just the locket, but a small packet wrapped in oiled cloth. Inside were papers covered with Blackwood's handwriting correspondence with Preacher Marcus, payment records for the raiders, and most damning of all, a detailed plan for grooming a young girl into the perfect victim. "I found these hidden in a false drawer in his desk," she said. "At first I thought they were just business records, but when I read them carefully..." Zeke scanned the documents, his anger building with each line. Blackwood had been meticulous in his planning, documenting every step of his scheme to possess a child, who'd caught his eye during a visit to Preacher Marcus's mission. The raid on her family's wagon train hadn't been random violence. It had been a calculated murder designed to deliver Melody into the hands of the very man who'd ordered her parents killed. "This changes everything," he said. "You're not just carrying evidence of land fraud. You're carrying proof that one of Colorado Territory's most prominent citizens was a child predator and mass murderer. No wonder they want me dead or alive. If this gets out, it'll bring down everyone connected to Blackwood's operations. Politicians, judges, business partners, half the territorial government could be implicated." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. More riders were coming up the mountain trail, and this time they weren't trying to hide their approach. "How many?" Melody asked, moving to the window. Zeke counted the figures emerging from the tree line. Too many, at least a dozen, maybe more. But as the riders drew closer, he realized something was wrong with his assessment. These weren't bounty hunters or hired guns. They were dressed differently, riding with the loose formation of men accustomed to working together rather than the tight discipline of mercenaries. "Hold your fire," called a familiar voice. "Zeke Ashborne, it's Tom Brennan. We got your signal." Relief flooded through Zeke as he recognized his old friend Tom, a mountain man who ran trap lines in the next valley over. The other riders were local men, trappers, prospectors, and small ranchers who'd answered his call for help. "How did they know to come?" Melody asked as Zeke unbarred the door. "Smoke signals. I sent up the pattern for help needed yesterday morning. Figured if those bounty hunters were going to bring reinforcements, I'd better do the same." Tom Brennan was a grizzled man in his 50s, with intelligent eyes and the kind of beard that came from months in the wilderness. He dismounted and approached the cabin, taking in the bodies scattered around the clearing. "Looks like the party started without us," he observed. "Just the opening act," Zeke replied. "Tom, I need to ask something of you and the boys, something that might get you all killed." "We figured that when we saw the smoke. What's the situation?" Zeke quickly explained about Melody, the documents she carried, and the conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. When he finished, Tom whistled low. "That's a hell of a thing, Zeke. You're talking about going up against some powerful people." "I know what I'm asking. Any man who wants to ride away, no questions asked. Tom looked around at his companions, tough, independent men who'd chosen to live by their own rules in country that didn't forgive weakness. "What do you say, boys? Feel like stirring up some trouble?" The response was immediate and unanimous. These were men who'd been pushed around by corrupt officials and crooked businessmen for years. The chance to strike back at the system that had oppressed them was too good to pass up. "What's the plan?" asked Jake Morrison, a young prospector who'd lost his claim to legal maneuvering the year before. "Get the lady and her evidence to Fort Collins," Zeke said. "Judge Morrison there is honest, and he's got the authority to act on what she's carrying. That's 200 miles through country that'll be crawling with bounty hunters," Tom pointed out. "Then we better make sure they don't get close enough to matter." As the mountain men gathered around to plan their route, Melody pulled Zeke aside. In her hand was the blood-stained handkerchief he'd carried for 20 years, the one that had started their journey toward this moment. "I remember this," she said softly. "You used it to wipe away my tears that night. You told me to be brave, that everything would be all right. I was wrong. Everything wasn't all right." "No," Melody agreed. "But maybe it can be now. Maybe that's what this has all been leading to, the chance to make it right." Looking into her eyes, Zeke saw not the frightened child he'd pulled from the flames, but a woman who'd survived 20 years of hell and emerged strong enough to fight back. The handkerchief between them was no longer just a reminder of past failures. It was a promise that this time he wouldn't let her face the darkness alone. Outside, a dozen mountain men prepared for war against corruption and power, while inside the cabin, two people bound by tragedy and time prepared to finish what had started with a child's tears and a simple act of kindness in a burning world. The evacuation from the cabin came at midnight, under cover of the new moon. Melody had spent the evening memorizing the escape route, while Zeke and Tom Brennan finalized their strategy. The mountain men would split into 3 groups, one to create a false trail leading north toward Wyoming, another to establish defensive positions along the actual route, and a core group to escort Melody directly to Fort Collins through the treacherous winter passes. "You sure about this path?" Tom asked, studying the hand-drawn map Zeke had sketched by firelight. "Devil's Backbone in winter has killed better men than us. It's killed men who were running scared and making mistakes," Zeke replied. "We'll be moving careful and deliberate. Besides, it's the last route they'll expect us to take." The Devil's Backbone was a narrow ridge that connected 2 mountain peaks, with 1,000-foot drops on both sides, and weather that could change from clear to deadly in minutes. Most sensible people avoided it even in summer. In winter, it was considered suicide, which was exactly why Zeke had chosen it. Melody listened to their planning with growing anxiety, not about the dangers ahead, but about what they were leaving behind. Her father's compass, the brass instrument that had guided her family west 20 years ago, lay heavy in her coat pocket. She'd been clutching it during her desperate flight through the blizzard, and somehow its steady presence had given her the strength to keep moving when everything else told her to lie down and die. "The compass still points true," she said suddenly, interrupting the men's tactical discussion. "What's that?" Zeke asked. "My father's compass." She pulled it from her pocket, the brass catching the firelight. "Even after all these years, all the violence and corruption and lies, it still points toward magnetic north. Some things can't be corrupted, no matter what people do to them." Tom studied the instrument with the appreciation of a man who'd trusted his life to similar devices. "That's a fine piece of work. Military issue? Survey quality. My father used it to map territories for the railroad." Melody closed the compass and tucked it away. He believed that accurate maps could prevent conflicts, help people find common ground instead of fighting over boundaries. "Sounds like a good man," Tom said simply. He was. They both were. Melody's voice carried 20 years of grief. They died believing they were helping build something better. Instead, they became victims of the very corruption they were trying to expose. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jake Morrison, who'd been scouting the valley below. His face was grim as he approached the fire. "Company coming," he reported. "Big company. Looks like every bounty hunter and hired gun in Colorado Territory got the word. I counted at least 30 riders making camp at the base of the mountain." Zeke cursed under his breath. 30 men was an army by frontier standards, far more than even his expanded group could hope to face in direct combat. "They're not planning to take prisoners," Tom observed. "That many guns means they're planning to sweep the mountain clean. Then we move now," Zeke decided, "before they can get organized." "In the dark? Through Devil's Backbone?" Jake's voice carried disbelief. "That's not tactical thinking. That's suicide." "No, it's the one thing they won't expect. They'll assume we're holed up here until morning, maybe trying to slip out during the pre-dawn hours. They won't be watching the ridge approaches because no sane person would attempt them at night." Melody felt her father's compass through the fabric of her coat, its weight a reminder of the man who'd taught her that sometimes the most difficult path was the only honest one. "How long would it take?" 8 hours if the weather holds," Zeke said. 12 if we hit snow, but we'd come out on the other side with a full day's head start. And if we don't make it, then at least we die trying instead of waiting for them to come kill us." The decision, when it came, was unanimous. The mountain men who'd answered Zeke's call weren't the type to choose safety over principle. They'd all lost something to the corruption that Melody's documents could expose: mining claims, land rights, family members who'd stood in the wrong person's way. This was their chance to strike back. As they prepared to leave, Melody found herself alone with Zeke for a few precious minutes. The cabin that had sheltered them felt different now, not like a home, but like a place they were abandoning to enemies. Everything they couldn't carry would be left behind, including memories that had taken root in the warmth of shared meals and quiet conversations. "I want you to know," she said, "that these past few days have been the first time I've felt safe since I was a child. Really safe, not just hiding. It won't be the last time," Zeke promised. "When this is over, when those documents reach the right people and justice is served, you'll have the chance to build whatever kind of life you want." "What if I want to build it here? In these mountains?" The question hung between them like morning mist, full of possibilities neither quite dared to name. Zeke had spent 20 years convincing himself that solitude was safety, that caring about someone only gave the world more ways to hurt him. But watching Melody move through his cabin, seeing how naturally she fit into the rhythms of mountain life, had awakened something he'd thought was dead forever. "These mountains can be hard on people," he said carefully, "especially in winter. I've survived 8 years of marriage to a monster. I think I can handle a little cold weather." Before Zeke could respond, Tom Brennan appeared in the doorway. "Time to move." Jake spotted signal fires in the valley. They're coordinating something big for morning. The evacuation moved like clockwork, each man knowing his role and executing it without unnecessary conversation. Melody traveled light, carrying only the essential documents, her father's compass, and the blood-stained handkerchief that had brought her and Zeke together. Everything else, the wooden horse, the burnt wagon wheel, even the wanted poster, stayed behind as evidence of lives that were ending and transforming. The mountain men had rigged the cabin with surprises for anyone who came looking. Nothing lethal, but enough to slow down pursuit and send a message that their quarry wouldn't be taken easily. "Shame to leave it," Tom said, looking back at the cabin as they reached the tree line. "Place had good bones. Places are just wood and stone," Zeke replied. "It's the people that make them matter." The trail to Devil's Backbone was treacherous even in daylight, a narrow path that wound between rocky outcroppings and stands of pine that blocked the starlight. In the darkness, every step required careful consideration. Every sound had to be muffled to avoid detection by the army gathering below. Melody found the night journey oddly peaceful despite the danger. Her father's compass guided them true, its needle steady, even when the path seemed to disappear entirely. The mountain men moved with the quiet confidence of people who belonged in this harsh landscape, and their presence around her felt like a shield against all the forces that had tried to destroy her. Halfway to the ridge, they paused at a sheltered overhang to rest and check their bearings. The valley below was dotted with campfires, where their enemies waited for dawn, but up here in the thin air and bitter cold, they were invisible. "How many people knew about your father's real mission?" Zeke asked as they shared water and dried meat. "I'm not sure. He was careful about who he trusted, but there had to be others. Honest surveyors, railroad officials who wanted accurate reports instead of fraudulent ones." Melody consulted her father's compass, noting how its steady presence calmed her racing heart. "The documents I'm carrying mention names, people who tried to help him and paid the price." "Living witnesses?" "Some, if they're still alive and willing to testify." She looked up at the star-filled sky, so clear and brilliant at this altitude that it seemed close enough to touch. "That's what I've been hoping for, that somewhere out there are good people who remember my father and what he was trying to accomplish." "There are," Tom said quietly, "more than you might think. Men like your father, trying to do honest work in a dishonest world. They're just waiting for someone brave enough to stand up first." As they prepared to resume their journey toward the most dangerous part of the trail, Melody felt her father's compass pulling her forward, not just geographically, but morally. Whatever waited for them on the other side of Devil's Backbone, justice or death, vindication or failure, she would face it with the same courage that had driven Thomas Fletcher to map territories where corruption flourished like weeds. The compass had brought her family west 20 years ago in search of honest work and a better future. Now it was guiding her toward the chance to fulfill that dream, to ensure that their deaths had not been meaningless and their daughter's suffering had not been in vain. Behind them, 30 armed men waited for dawn to begin their hunt. Ahead lay the Devil's Backbone, a test of courage and skill that would determine whether justice or corruption would triumph in the Colorado Territory. The compass needle pointed steady and true, magnetic north, unchanged by human greed or violence. Some things, Melody realized, were indeed beyond corruption, and perhaps that was enough to build a future on. Dawn broke grey and cold over Devil's Backbone, revealing the full terror of what they'd accomplished in darkness. The ridge stretched before them like a knife blade, barely wide enough for single file, with nothing but empty air and jagged rocks 1,000 feet below on both sides. Wind whipped across the exposed stone with enough force to knock a man off balance, and ice made every step treacherous. But they'd made it this far alive, and the valley behind them showed no signs of pursuit. The enemy army was probably just now discovering the empty cabin and the false trails the mountain men had laid during the night. "Jesus," Jake Morrison breathed, looking back at the path they'd just traversed. "I can't believe we made it across that in the dark." "Don't look down," Tom Brennan advised, though his own voice carried a tremor. "And don't think too hard about going back." Melody pulled her father's compass from her coat, checking their bearing against the map Zeke had drawn. The needle pointed steadily northeast, toward Fort Collins and Judge Morrison, and the chance to finally see justice done. But between here and there lay the most dangerous part of their journey, the descent from Devil's Backbone into territory where Blackwood's allies controlled the law. "How much further to safe ground?" she asked. 6 miles to the tree line, then another 4 to the settlement at Bear Creek," Zeke replied. "From there, we can get horses and supplies for the final push to Fort Collins. And if they're waiting for us at Bear Creek, then we find another way." His tone carried the quiet confidence of someone who'd faced impossible odds before and survived. "There's always another way." But even as he spoke, movement in the valley below caught his attention. Riders were spreading out from the main camp, moving with the purposeful coordination of a search pattern. Someone had figured out their true route faster than expected. "Tom," Zeke called quietly, "take a look at this." The older mountain man produced a spyglass and studied the distant figures. After a moment, he swore creatively. "That's Marcus Hendricks leading them, the preacher himself." Melody's face went pale. "Marcus is here, after all these years." "Makes sense," Zeke said grimly. "He's got the most to lose if those documents reach the wrong people. 20 years of selling children, taking bribes, enabling murder. He'll hang for sure if the truth comes out. Then he'll do anything to stop us." The sound of gunfire echoed across the valley, distant but unmistakable. Someone was shooting at something, though at this distance it was impossible to tell what. The decoy group, Tom realized. They found our boys heading north. More shots followed, a sustained exchange that suggested serious fighting. Zeke felt his chest tighten with guilt. Good men were dying to buy them time, mountain folk who'd answered his call for help and were now paying the price for his choices. "We have to move," he said. "Every minute we stay here is a minute they're risking their lives for us." The descent from Devil's Backbone proved even more treacherous than the crossing. The trail switched back down a nearly vertical cliff face, with loose stone and hidden ice making every step a gamble with gravity. Melody found herself relying on her father's compass, not just for direction, but for courage. Its steady weight in her hand, a reminder that some things remained, constant even when the world seemed to be crumbling around her. Halfway down, disaster struck. Jake Morrison's foot slipped on a patch of black ice, and he tumbled sideways toward the edge. Tom Brennan lunged to catch him, but the movement started a small avalanche of loose rocks that clattered down the cliff face like thunder. "Everyone freeze!" Zeke hissed. "Too late." The sound echoed across the valley, and within minutes they could see riders changing direction, heading straight for the base of the cliff. The element of surprise was gone. "How long until they reach us?" Melody asked. Zeke studied the approaching riders through Tom's spyglass. 20 minutes, maybe 30 if they take the safe route around the creek. "And how long to reach the bottom?" 40 minutes at best speed, longer if we want to arrive alive. The mathematics of pursuit were simple and unforgiving. They couldn't outrun mounted men, couldn't hide on an exposed cliff face, and couldn't fight from a position where one stray bullet could send them all tumbling into the abyss. But Melody had spent 8 years married to a man who thought in terms of power and control, who believed that superior force always triumphed over superior principle. She'd learned something different during those dark years, that sometimes the only way to win was to change the rules of the game entirely. "I'm going down alone," she announced, pulling off the wedding ring she'd worn like a shackle for 8 years. The golden band caught the morning light for a moment before she flung it into the void, watching it disappear among the rocks below. "Like hell you are," Zeke said immediately. "Think about it. They want me and the documents. If I give myself up, they'll stop chasing the rest of you. You can circle back, gather the others, maybe even rescue me later. That's not a plan. That's suicide." "No," Melody said, looking at the discarded wedding ring that had symbolized 8 years of captivity. "That's liberation. For the first time in my adult life, I get to choose what happens next, even if it's the last choice I ever make." The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls. The standoff lasted exactly 17 minutes. Zeke knew because he counted every second, watching the riders below position themselves while his small group remained trapped on the cliff face like flies in a spider's web. "Melody Rivers," Marcus Hendricks's voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air. "I know you're up there. Come down, and we can discuss this like civilized people." "Civilized?" Melody called back, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her. "You sold me to a monster when I was 6 years old. We're long past civilized. I saved your life, gave you food, shelter, education. Everything you became, you owe to me. Everything I survived despite you." Tom Brennan was studying the enemy positions through his spyglass. 32 men that I can count, all armed, all professional, but they're spread thin trying to cover the whole base of the cliff. "Doesn't matter," Zeke replied. "We can't fight them from here, and we can't retreat. Then we do what mountain folk have always done when the odds are impossible, Tom said, reaching into his pack. We make some noise and see what happens. He pulled out 3 sticks of dynamite, mining charges left over from his prospecting days. The sight of the explosives changed everything about their tactical situation. You planning to blow the whole cliff? Jake asked nervously. Just enough to give them something to think about. Tom grinned with the enthusiasm of a man who'd spent his life solving problems with controlled explosions. See that overhang about 50 feet above us? Drop that on their heads and suddenly we're not the ones trapped. It was insane. It was dangerous. It would probably kill them all. Light the fuses, Zeke ordered. The explosion, when it came, was louder than thunder and more violent than earthquake. Half the cliff face peeled away in a roar of stone and snow, creating an avalanche that swept down toward the men below like the wrath of an angry god. The concussion knocked everyone on the remaining ledge flat, and for a terrifying moment, Melody thought the whole mountain was coming apart. When the dust settled, the tactical situation had completely reversed. The avalanche had scattered the enemy riders, killed at least 6 of them outright, and created a barrier of rubble that would take hours to clear. More importantly, it had revealed something none of them had expected, a signal fire blazing on the opposite ridge. "Well, I'll be damned," Tom breathed, studying the smoke pattern through his spyglass. "That's Bill Crawford's mark. The old bear actually made it." "Who's Bill Crawford?" Melody asked, her ears still ringing from the blast. "Mountain man who's been trapping these hills for 30 years, Zeke explained. "We sent word to him yesterday, asking for help. I figured he was too far away to matter." "Bill Crawford doesn't know the meaning of too far away," Tom said with admiration. "Look at that smoke pattern. He's got at least 20 men with him, maybe more." The sound of gunfire erupted from the far side of the valley as Crawford's reinforcements engaged the scattered remnants of Hendrix's army. What had been a hopeless siege suddenly became a running battle between 2 forces of roughly equal size. "Now we move," Zeke decided, while they're distracted. The descent became a controlled fall down loose scree and broken rock, made possible only by the chaos below that prevented accurate enemy fire. Melody clutched her father's compass like a talisman, using its steady presence to maintain her balance as the world seemed to shift and slide around her. They reached the valley floor to find Marcus Hendrix waiting with a rifle pointed directly at Melody's chest. He'd somehow survived the avalanche and positioned himself perfectly to intercept their escape route. 20 years, he said, his once smooth preacher's voice now cracked with age and desperation. 20 years I've been building something magnificent, and you want to tear it all down for what? Sentiment? Some misguided notion of justice? For the truth, Melody replied, standing straighter despite the rifle aimed at her heart. For my parents. For all the families you and Blackwood destroyed. Your parents were fools who died for nothing. At least I made their sacrifice meaningful by ensuring their daughter had a purpose. My purpose was never yours to decide. Hendrix's finger tightened on the trigger. It is now. The shot, when it came, was not from Hendrix's rifle but from Zeke's, fired from a position the preacher hadn't seen him reach. Marcus Hendrix crumpled to the ground, his weapon unfired. 20 years of corruption and cruelty ended by a single, precise bullet. "Papa Zeke," Melody whispered, using the name she'd called him as a frightened child. "You came back for me." "I never left," he replied, gathering her into his arms as gunfire continued to echo across the valley. "And this time, I'm never letting you go." Around them, the battle raged between Crawford's mountain men and the last of Blackwood's hired killers. But in that moment, holding each other as the smoke cleared and justice finally arrived in the Colorado Territory, they had found their way home. Spring came early to the Colorado Territory that year, melting the snow and revealing the foundation stones of a new cabin. The site Zeke and Melody had chosen overlooked the valley where their enemies had made their last stand, but the view held no darkness now, only the promise of fresh beginnings built on solid ground. "Hand me that stone there, the flat one," Melody called, from where she knelt arranging the corner supports. Her hands, once soft from years of forced idleness, now bore the honest calluses of someone who built her own future. Zeke hefted the granite slab, noting how naturally she'd taken to construction work. 3 months had passed since Judge Morrison had reviewed her documents and issued warrants that brought down half the territorial government. The trials were still ongoing, but the immediate danger was over. Colorado Territory was learning to live without the corruption that had poisoned it for decades. "That goes there perfectly," Melody said, running her fingers along the stone's edge. "My father would have appreciated the craftsmanship. Your father would have been proud of his daughter," Zeke replied, settling the foundation stone into place. "Standing up to that kind of power, risking everything for justice that takes courage most people never find." Around them, the mountain community buzzed with activity. Tom Brennan and his boys were raising the cabin's walls, while Bill Crawford supervised the construction of what would become the valley's first proper schoolhouse. The children needed education, and Melody had volunteered to serve as their teacher once the building was complete. "Miss Melody," called Sarah Beth, one of the youngsters from Pine Ridge, "can you tell us that story again? The one about the brave compass?" Melody smiled, pulling her father's brass compass from her apron pocket. Even after all these months, she carried it everywhere, its steady presence a reminder of the path that had brought her home. "Once upon a time," she began, settling onto a wooden stump as the children gathered around, "there was a compass that always pointed true, no matter how lost its owner became." The story had evolved in the telling, becoming a parable about finding one's way through darkness and uncertainty. The children loved it, but Zeke suspected they were really drawn to the storyteller, a woman who'd faced monsters and survived, who spoke to them with the gentle authority of someone who understood both suffering and hope. The compass knew, little Timothy Morrison piped up, that some things can't be broken, no matter what bad people do to them. "That's exactly right," Melody confirmed, ruffling his hair. "Some things are stronger than corruption or cruelty. Love is stronger, truth is stronger, and family, the family you choose, not just the one you're born into, is strongest of all." As the children dispersed to help with the construction, Melody found herself alone with Zeke among the foundation stones of their new life. The cabin would be larger than his old one, with separate rooms and windows facing east to catch the morning light. It would be a home for the family they were creating, not just the two of them, but the orphaned children they'd already begun taking in, young souls who needed what they had learned to give. "Any regrets?" Zeke asked, watching her arrange flowers from the meadow in a mason jar. "About which part? Killing my husband, bringing down the territorial government, or agreeing to marry a grizzled old mountain man who snores like a hibernating bear?" "I don't snore." "You absolutely snore. Ask Tom, he says they can hear you 3 valleys over." Zeke grinned, the expression transforming his weathered features into something almost boyish. At 68, he'd learned to smile again, to plan for a future that extended beyond mere survival. The mountain man who'd lived alone for 20 years now found himself at the center of a growing community, respected as the elder who'd helped bring justice to a corrupt territory. "The wedding's still set for next week?" he asked. "Unless you're getting cold feet about marrying a former murder suspect." "Former justified homicide defendant," he corrected. Judge Morrison was very clear about that distinction. Their laughter carried across the valley, mixing with the sounds of construction and children's voices and the everyday bustle of people building something good together. The wooden horses Zeke carved now graced windowsills throughout the settlement, gifts for children who'd learned to associate his presence with safety rather than fear. The ceremony, when it came, was simple and perfect. Bill Crawford officiated, having been ordained by mail-order ministry specifically for the occasion. Tom Brennan served as best man, while Sarah Beth scattered wildflowers before the bride. The entire mountain community attended, turning the wedding into a celebration of survival and hope. As they exchanged vows beneath the Colorado sky, Melody thought of her parents and how proud they would have been to see their daughter find happiness after so much pain. The compass in her wedding dress pocket pointed steady and true, no longer guiding her toward an uncertain destination, but confirming that she'd finally arrived where she belonged. "I promise," Zeke said, his voice carrying across the meadow, "to never again let you face the darkness alone." "And I promise," Melody replied, "to never again doubt that love is stronger than the worst things people can do to each other." Their first dance was to a melody. Melody hummed not the haunted tune of her childhood, but something new and hopeful, a song for the future they would build together on foundation stones laid with their own hands. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold and rose, the newest family in Pine Ridge settled into their completed cabin. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more children to teach, more foundations to lay for the community growing around them. But tonight, for the first time in 20 years, both Ezekiel Ashborne and Melody Fletcher Ashborne went to sleep, knowing they were exactly where they belonged, home at last, surrounded by the family they'd chosen and the love they'd fought so hard to protect. The compass rested on the bedside table, its needle pointing true as always, a reminder that some journeys end exactly where they should.